I may be in the minority when I say this, but the thought of nuclear war has really never felt like a talking point of existential threats for Gen Z, aka my generation. The biggest issues that seem to plague them are usually issues like climate change, abortion, gun violence, etc. But whenever we were taught about the bombings of Japan and the subsequent Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, I think it's safe to say most of us learned about these events in like a paragraph from a history book made in the 90s, and I'm also willing to bet that it was taught by an overweight coach. In other words, we not only don't comprehend the devastation of nuclear warfare, but we also don't understand the absolute state of panic and anxiety people felt about it at the time. I think a good way to get a feel for the times is to observe the art that was being made. And during the time of the Cold War, I think it's safe to say there were a plethora of nuclear themes within media. The things I want to cover in this video is how this fear influenced animation, specifically 3 movies. I'm going to cover the films from least effective to most effective in getting their points across about the horrors of nuclear war. Though I want to preface going forward that these are just my opinions. All of these films are great and extremely effective in doing what they're trying to do. I'm just ranking them based on how they affected me personally. So with that, let's begin. Barefoot Gen is an anime created in 1983 and follows the story of a boy named Gen as his family tried to make it day by day in Hiroshima during World War II. Due to the war and constant airstrikes by US forces, things like food, work, and medical care are very hard to come by. Now, when I first started watching this movie, I must admit I was wondering what I got myself into because it felt like a children's movie. That's not to say that's a bad thing, but the character models and the overall style with the voice acting and music made it feel like it was catered towards a younger audience. Besides some heavy subject matter here and there, I was curious as to how they were going to handle the eventual nuclear attack, and trust me, we will get into that. So the movie starts out and it follows Jin, who's the middle child of this family. He has an older sister, but the main focus, the emotional heart, is on the relationship he has with his younger brother, Shinji, as they navigate growing up under the guidance of their father, who's critical of Japan's involvement in the war.
お父ちゃん、そんなこと言うからみんなから非国民って呼ばれるんだろうが。
こんな人を殺し合う戦争が正しいはずなじゃろ。
They also have a mom who's in the final weeks of her pregnancy, but as food is becoming scarce, she becomes really weak. Desperate for a solution, Jin takes his brother on a mission to steal a fish from a man's pond. They get caught trying to steal one, and after the man punches them both in the face, Jin begs him to keep punching him, and in exchange they keep the fish. They literally get beaten to a pulp if it meant it helped their mom even for a short while. This was my first indication that this film could go to some pretty serious places in an instant. The man ends up letting them take the fish, and the plot continues on until one day there's supposed to be an announced air raid. But something's different. The raid gets cut short and it seems to have been cancelled. That is until Jin notices something in the sky as he walks to school later that day. The animation during the bombing sequence is so intense, I'm not even sure if I can show it on YouTube without it getting flagged. The tone that was somewhat childlike is completely gone, and the film indulges in overwhelming nightmare fuel. It shows the slow burning and disintegration of everyone, including animals and babies. The brutality of a nuclear bomb is on full display, and they shy away from nothing. Jin miraculously survives, but is subjugated to seeing the people damaged by the bomb. Again, I can't show some of this, but the artwork for these essentially walking burnt corpses is terrifying. He has a line where he says they're ghosts, which I think is his way of him processing what he's seeing. I don't want to spoil the movie from here, but it's basically him trying to keep members of his family alive in this nuclear wasteland. The tonal shift in this movie was something I was not expecting, but even as dark and overwhelmingly graphic as it gets, it does give you some moments of what it was like in the first half with the cheesy music and bright, happy imagery. The reason I think they keep this childlike tone is that it's showing you what this is like from the perspective of Jin. And I gotta say, this kid is an angel. Even in the face of the horrors of war, Jin is incredibly loyal to those he loves, and the film shows time and time again that even in the most dire situations, He is constantly looking for solutions. He will never give up on those he loves, even if it's at the cost of his own safety. The reason I would put this in last place, though, is not because it's bad. I thought it was really good. It just comes down to personal preference. Some of the creative decisions that, to be fair, are staples of a lot of anime are present here. The film goes over the top with its imagery and style, which at times works masterfully, and at other times makes it feel tonally inconsistent. If it had more subtle approaches to things in the beginning and during the sections towards the second half, I think this could have taken the second or possibly top spot on my list. Overall, a good film with utterly horrifying sequences of destruction. A Short Vision is a British animated short made in 1956 and basically documents all forms of life as a narrator explains their reaction to a nuclear bomb going off. This film, I would say, is by far and away the bleakest on the list. If Gen had some form of optimism and warmer moments, this short is clinical and direct with its messaging. The art style complements the themes as well. They look like paintings when still, but the movements they have make it look like a mixture of stop motion and puppetry, the two creepiest styles of animation in my opinion. The film starts out as the narrator describes an object flying over a nameless city. On the outskirts, we see a leopard catch a deer for food, but this object catches their attention. Their basic animal instincts to fight and run stop as this object flies over their heads. The same happens to an owl and rat. All these forms of conflict between animals stop as they observe and subsequently hide out of fear of this strange object in the sky. The object finally makes it over the city, and this one piece of narration really hit me.
When it flew over the city, the people were all asleep. But their leaders looked up, and their wise men looked up. But it was too late.
I like this because I feel it ties into the animals we saw at the beginning. The power imbalances inherent in nature. If you are one of the leaders as powerful as a leopard, or the men as wise as an owl, it doesn't matter. All forms of conflict or cultural status cease to matter anymore. The bomb finally goes off, and much like Barefoot Gen, it's quite graphic. Specifically this one shot of a man as it shows his face melt and burn off. Due to the slow frame rate, it feels like we're able to see each stage of disintegration. It shows this happening to everyone mentioned before, including the animals. Any form of life evaporates within an instant, and thus concludes the short. This short is what I like to call a fly-on-the-wall story, where you're basically detached from everything shown to you, and you instead simply observe how a series of events unfolds. It doesn't emotionally tug on your heartstrings, but it's not really meant to. What this feels like is a last-minute effort to show the people of the world, hey guys, if we don't cool down, this will be our fate. Where this film stands above for me is the animation style and sound. It's like the horrifying moments of Barefoot Gen are compressed into 8 minutes. Even with the short runtime, it leaves an impression I think few are going to forget. But now, we've come to my number one. A cartoon that perfectly encapsulates not only the horrors of nuclear war, but those whom it affects. And that film is When the Wind Blows, I believe, is nothing short of a masterpiece. This film is essentially everything I wanted it to be. It's got an emotional hook with the lead characters we follow. The animation is the most unique blend of 2D mixed with live action I've seen in a long time. And the writing delivers not only a gut-punching tragedy, but a brilliant satire as well. The story follows an elderly couple living in the British countryside during the height of the Cold War in the 80s. As they receive daily news that the tensions are escalating between the US and the Soviet Union, they begin preparing for the fallout. The biggest strength of this movie to me is the characters named James and Hilda, the only characters we follow throughout the entire movie. I think the reason they work so well as leads is that they are so innocently adorable. They genuinely love each other's company, and their greatest strength as a couple is the trust that they have in each other. The only problem is that James and Hilda are incredibly naive to the horrors that accompany nuclear war and fallout. Since they grew up during the Blitz in World War II, they almost have a nostalgic view on times of war, and they believe their government leaders know what's best for them. After all, they were handed the official government pamphlets on how to survive the explosion and subsequent fallout. Everything will be fine, right? Uh-oh. Basically, the first third of the movie is them prepping their house for the explosion. They paint the windows white to protect them from the blinding light and create a shelter using mattresses and pillows around their home. They're also instructed to use large bags or sacks to wear for protection against the radiation and blast. Now, this might sound like absolute nonsense to us today, but the measures they took were actually instructions given out by governments at the time. James educates himself on the instructions and takes the situation seriously, but as I mentioned before, doesn't grasp that everything in the pamphlet will do nothing against a nuke. This is demonstrated perfectly when after he talks to his son over the phone about the measures he's taking to ensure their safety, his son just laughs at him.
Stop laughing, will you? I'm surprised at you. You're supposed to be a responsible father now.
This represents the different perceptions generations had on nuclear war. James is willing to follow his leader's advice because during World War II, they're the ones that led people to victory. However, his son has practically given up on trying to reason with them, as he knows there's nothing they can do. James's wife, Hilda, is probably the most ignorant of all. From the very beginning, it shows she doesn't take this conflict seriously, as to her it's all sports and rubbish. Even when it's told to them through the radio a bomb is about to drop, she's more focused on a load of laundry or her cake in the oven. This scene, while an intense tonal shift, delivers one of the most out of nowhere yet hilarious lines I've heard in a long time.
Come back, you stupid bitch, and get in the shelter!
I know I'm not the only person on YouTube to cover that line, but I don't care. That's hilarious. What's not hilarious is the events that follow. Once they duck for cover, we see the complete destruction the bomb creates. While nowhere near as graphic and disturbing as the previous two movies, I think this is meant to encapsulate the absolute physical destruction and chaos of the situation. This point is driven home not only by the chaotic art style, but the music and sound mixing. Once the bomb has gone off, this is where the film takes a very dark turn. What this movie excels at is making you feel absolute dread for the welfare of James and Hilda. This wholesome, lovely couple is now exposed to tons of nuclear radiation, and we have no choice but to sit there and watch as they slowly deteriorate. But what makes this even worse is that even after seeing the state of their home and the outside, they still go on with daily life as if it was a minor inconvenience. The first thing Hilda begins to worry about is how they are going to clean the curtains after they got so dirty. They spend their days as they did before, having breakfast and afternoon tea, doing chores, but as we can see, the characters slowly begin inhabiting symptoms of radiation poisoning. Even with everything clearly showing that the world they knew is gone, James desperately comes up with every scenario he can to explain what's happening to them. You become so frustrated with them because of their ignorance of the situation, but that's the entire point. Even if they are blind to the situation, the film, I think, makes sure this is not a criticism of the people, but instead of those in power, because the reality is the government is the one who created this conflict and lied to its citizens about the situation. The film's message, while dark, is an important one to not only hold those in power accountable for their actions, but to also question what they tell you to do. These solutions they give in their emergency pamphlets are obvious bullshit, but you'll be surprised what people will buy into in times of crisis. Now, I won't spoil the ending, but I think with what I've described as the basic premise, you can figure out where this film is going to go. And yes, it's as heartbreaking as you think. As tragic as this movie is, I think it's one of those films like Schindler's List or Grave of the Fireflies. Movies that are so profoundly sad, but you need to watch at least once in your life. Now, you might be wondering, what was the point of this video? To be honest, I wanted to follow up my other serious video I did a couple weeks ago with something that frightened me, that being nuclear fallout. But now looking at the current landscape of people in America, it has me concerned. This isn't a dig against either side of the aisle. That's not what this is. I think no matter what side you stand on, you have to admit we're reaching a boiling point culturally. While we all have our thoughts and feelings about the election, it's important to always understand people who are having an opposite reaction to yours. Sure, you can make memes and laugh about it. I'm guilty of that. But I do always make an effort, whether I succeed in it or not, to try and understand people's opinions who differ from mine. I think that's the beauty of something like movies and animation. It can bring people together and showcase common values. But I fear the more we drift from that, the more we shift away from what makes us similar and instead focus on our differences, we could meet a fate similar to these characters in the films I covered. That's not saying there's going to be a nuclear war, but what I will say is that in war, there are no winners. In war, it affects all walks of life. I hope after watching this video and seeing these movies, we can all agree we don't want this as our future.